Okay, so thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Um, for those of you who are not familiar with the Illinois RiverWatch Network, RiverWatch is a community science organization that trains volunteers to monitor water quality in their own communities. The mission of RiverWatch is to safeguard the future of Illinois rivers and streams through stewardship, education, and sound science. Before we get started, I ask that you keep your microphone muted during the presentation. We will have a Q&A session after the presentation, so if you have a question, you can either put it into the chat box to be answered at the end, or you can save the question and ask it aloud. Now I would like to introduce our speaker tonight, Katie O'Reilly. Katie is the Aquatic Invasive Species Specialist for Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant and the Illinois Natural History Survey. In her role, she works to provide individuals and organizations with the knowledge and tools to prevent the introduction and spread of harmful non-native plants and animals across the Great Lakes Basin. Before joining Sea Grant, Katie completed her PhD at the University of Notre Dame, where she studied fish use of Lake Michigan coastal wetlands. And with that, I would like to welcome Katie O'Reilly.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hannah. And thanks everybody for being here tonight. Really excited to chat with y'all. So yeah, as Hannah graciously introduced me, my name is Katie, and I am here today to talk about aquatic invasive species and essentially, what we can do about them. So I work for both Illinois Indiana Sea Grant, as mentioned, as well as the Illinois Natural History Survey. And that means I get to spend a lot of time hanging around some of our state's most valuable resources, that is our rivers and lakes, whether it's providing recreation opportunities, providing transportation, or, just the simple drinking water that we all value. These are really valuable ecosystems, which I probably don't have to tell this group twice. But at the same time, our rivers and lakes do face a lot of challenges. Probably more than we have time to spend tonight, but just as a few, pollution, the loss or degradation of habitat, and probably most relevant for tonight's talk, the threat of harmful non-native species, what we call invasives. And these non-native species that we'll talk about tonight really do have costs beyond, dollar amounts. There's costs in terms of those things that we value, those things like the drinking water, transportation, recreation, or just even the aesthetic value that we put on our waterways. Invasive species kind of, one of their most notable costs is that they do outcompete a lot of our native species, whether that's an invasive fish coming in that outcompetes native fish that we value, like, smallmouth bass or northern pike. Beyond just the competition with the native species, invasives can often actually impact or alter the landscape around them. There's things like invasive crayfish that actually can cause the erosion of stream banks by their digging and burrowing habits. A lot of invasive species, especially aquatic invasive plants, can actually impede transportation, which is a big deal, especially when we think about the Mississippi River and the importance of that as an artery of transportation, especially when things like, again, invasive aquatic plants grow to these huge, massive numbers. They can really impact, both a cargo ship as well as just your recreational boater who wants to go out for a day on the water. And speaking of recreation, beyond, any kind of limiting of transportation, getting your boat out on the lake, invasive species can also extract a pretty high cost in terms of just the general enjoyment of waterways, whether that's reduced fishing, opportunities, if you have things like a fish die-off caused by invasive species that just really impact our ability to enjoy these recreation opportunities. And just for the Great Lakes states alone, that kind of dollar amount, so not even thinking about the aesthetic, cultural value that we place on it, but the dollar amount that aquatic invasive species cost to Great Lakes states is well over $1 million annually, so not insignificant costs at all. So what I'd like to do tonight with you guys is really talk about two main goals, and that is learning a little bit about some of the impacts of aquatic invasive species, using a couple of examples of species that we have here in Illinois, and then really thinking about what we can do as individuals, as organizations, to help prevent and control aquatic invasive species. But first, I think it's important to actually define what an invasive species is, because you may see a lot of different terms around non-native introduced species. And just in my own definition of that, I said non-native introduced. You may see things like this poster that is all the non-indigenous species that have been introduced to the Great Lakes. Sometimes you'll see exotic, you name it, there's been terms for invasive species. But generally, what scientists consider invasive is a species that meets a few different criteria. And that is one, non-native to a particular location. An invasive species is also one that has become established. And what biologists mean by established is that the population is able to, reproduce, it's able to self-propagate, beyond just having a single, one or two single individuals in a new place. And then another important aspect of invasive, and one that is a little bit more subjective, is the harm that this causes. And what we mean by harmful is it harmful ecologically? Is it harmful economically? Maybe it's both. Maybe it's beneficial economically, but harmful ecologically. So this is one that is more based on human values, but it is a really important consideration. There's obviously a ton of different invasive species we could talk about, but just in general, some of the characteristics that these successful invasive species share is that they're able to withstand a lot of different environmental conditions. They're usually pretty hardy. They reproduce very quickly. Oftentimes, they reproduce earlier than maybe a native species. Maybe they can spread in different ways, such as like with aquatic plants, they can fragment and restart a new organism. So in general, when you think about invasive species, those are characteristics that are associated. And now invasive species, species can move by themselves, but when we think about specifically invasive species, we generally think about pathways that they're introduced through human activity. And these can be both introductions that are done intentionally as well as those that are done unintentionally or accidental. And so when we think about intentional introductions, this is oftentimes for, growing organisms or, plants or animals for food, for their use as pets. And oftentimes, like similar to pets, things like ornamentals or water gardens that are more for, aesthetic purposes. However, there's oftentimes a lot of unintentional spread, and this sometimes goes hand in hand with like, oh, you have a species that you have as a pet, or you're raising it in an aquaculture pond for food, but maybe a flood allows it to spread to a new location, and that's unintentional. One thing that I think a lot about in my work is hitchhikers. So when boats or fishing gear have, maybe it's some aquatic plants, and those can harbor little eggs or larvae on them that they could spread to new places, as well as if we create man-made waterways such as canals, that can allow invasive species to gain access to new places. And so I'm not going to hit you guys with a ton of data tonight, but I am, because I know it's an evening, but I wanted to pull up this invasion curve because this is actually a really interesting concept that I think really illustrates why it's so difficult to manage invasive species. And we'll see some of this through the examples I give um, throughout the talk. But just to orient you to what you're looking at here, this is a figure that shows on the left-hand side, basically the introduction of a new species in a place. And then as you move to the right, that's increasing time. And essentially, what you see kind of vertically is over time, you know, numbers generally are really tiny, like population size is very small at the beginning of an invasion. You have one or two individuals, maybe there's somebody dumped a fish tank. But over time, as species are able to reproduce, it becomes harder and harder to actually eradicate that population because they can cover more area. It's oftentimes more expensive. So it's generally, once we are aware of a problem, that's kind of that middle part of the curve. That's when the public awareness begins. Land managers are aware of the problem. At that point, it's already getting really tough to manage the invasive population. The two spots where it's actually the easiest to manage it are the hardest steps to do. And that's understanding, like being able to find populations when they're still really small. Maybe they're just in a single pond or a single stretch of a river. And that's why it's really important to be able to do early detection because that's when it's easier for managers to be able to like feasibly control a population. So I know this is kind of a lot to take in, but I think it's good to keep in mind as we think about some of the invasive species we have in Illinois and some of the things that we can do to help prevent the spread of them and any future invaders. And I lied a little bit because I said I wasn't going to hit you with data, but I think this will be my one scientific paper I cite in tonight's talk. And it is a paper that actually came out just a couple of months ago in the Journal of Great Lakes Research, where a group of researchers actually wanted to look at what have been the most harmful aquatic invasive species in the Great Lakes. And so this is their top 10 list of most harmful. And you probably see, maybe a couple of familiar names. Maybe there's some that aren't quite as, well known to you. But I'm actually going to talk a little bit about my two examples are ones that we have here in Illinois and are on this list. And that is the zebra and the quagga mussels and the grass carp, which is one of our invasive carp species that we're dealing with. And so I had to leave this in because it's species that we have in our Illinois rivers beyond just the Great Lakes, but these have been some of the most impactful species as assessed by this research group. So let's dive on in, and I want to start by talking about zebra and quagga mussels because they are, not only ubiquitous in Lake Michigan, but we've seen them spread inland. And despite their relatively small size, they've had quite a big impact. So I'll often say like zebra and quagga mussels, and they are two different species that are really closely related. They're members of the Dreisseniid family, and both are native to the Black Sea, Caspian Sea, or Caspian Sea region of Eastern Europe, Western Asia. So you're probably thinking, okay, Eastern Europe, Western Asia, how did they get to North America? And we actually first saw them in North America in the Great Lakes in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And at the time, scientists were trying to figure out how did they get here, and eventually found what had been happening is that a lot of the ocean-going cargo ships in the Great Lakes have to take in ballast water in order to control their buoyancy, between when they have cargo and when they unload. And so typically what happens is at the source ports, so in Eastern Europe, they will take in water from the surrounding environment, um, make the voyage to North America, and then when they are loading cargo in North America, they would discharge ballast water at the destination port. And now this goes both ways too. So there's been species that have, made it from North America to other places through this, but this is the primary pathway where zebra mussels and quagga mussels were able to make it to North America. We have seen, since they've been introduced to the Great Lakes, they've been able to spread to like inland waters, inland lakes, rivers and streams, because they are really, really good at attaching to your boat, your fishing gear, your waders. They've got these really tiny microscopic larvae called veligers, which do a really good job of sticking to everything, and they can handle being out of the water for, an extended period of time. So it's tough to battle, especially when it's something that's invisible to the naked eye. And, beyond the out competition of native mussels, our native freshwater mussels, which I think this image just does such a wonderful job of like encapsulating that. One of the biggest impacts we've seen from both the zebra and the quagga mussels, because they basically function the same, is that they're really, really good at filter feeding. So they basically, like any mussel, they kind of hang out on the bottom and wait for food to float by them, and then take it in, which is good actually if you want really clear water. The problem that we're, with really clear water where you have, increased water clarity, low turbidity, but you're also having really low plankton concentrations in some places. There are now parts of Lake Michigan and Lake Huron that are clearer than Lake Superior, which is kind of crazy as like a freshwater ecologist to think about, because we always think freshwater Lake Superior is like this super clear water. And I often get like asked, is it good that the water is clear because it looks nicer? And not really. What we're seeing as a result of that really great filtering is that we don't have the plankton in the water column that supports all of the food web. So we're seeing, native fish species unable to get to like the size that they're able to be caught because a lot of the young of those species rely on plankton. And so we're losing them at that young stage. They're not able to get to adulthood. At the same time, we're also actually seeing that the increased sunlight that's able to penetrate the lake can sometimes increase like the amount of nuisance algae or even harmful algal blooms. So clear water, it looks nice, but it's not always the best ecologically speaking. Zebra and quagga mussels can actually cause a lot of damage to infrastructure as well. I mentioned that they tend to grow on the bottom, but they often grow wherever there's a hard surface. So if you have pipes, you have docks, you have a buoy, chances are if there's zebra or quagga mussels in that water body, it's going to be on that equipment as well. This often is a big issue, especially for power plants or water intake systems where they have those pipes, especially connected to things like Lake Michigan. And then I think one thing I just find is another impact that's really interesting biologically, but also kind of depressing, is we believe that there's a connection between zebra and quagga mussels and the increases we see in water bird die-offs due to avian botulism. And this is because as I mentioned earlier, with that filter feeding ability, they basically are bringing the energy to the bottom of the lake, and this is creating additional habitat for the bacteria that causes the botulism in birds. So one of those like indirect, but still really significant impacts that aren't always quite as obvious. And so at this point, you're probably like, okay, Katie, zebra and quagga mussels, not great news. What can we do about them? Honestly, there's not a ton of control, unfortunately, once you have an established population of zebra or quagga mussels. There are some experimental treatments, some chemicals that can be applied. There's been research into carbon dioxide treatments as well as water drawdowns that you could do, seasonally to reduce the numbers. However, oftentimes these treatments are only effective when you have a localized small invasion. Say you have like a lake that's, pretty isolated from everything else, you're able to just like hit it really hard. But even then it's often really tough. And especially when we're thinking about large water bodies, Lake Michigan, Illinois River, Mississippi River, it's just not feasible to have that full eradication. So on that positive note, let's talk about one other example. And I think this is one that a lot of you may have heard about. You may know them as invasive carp. We've moved away from the term Asian carp just to be a little bit more specific because it's actually 4 different species of carp: the silver, bighead, black, and grass. And so these guys actually all started showing up in Illinois rivers in like the 90s-ish, but we've really started seeing the populations take off starting in the 2000s. They are, like I mentioned, 4 different species. I will caution that the black carp and grass carp, here they look different because they've got slightly colors, but in real life, they actually look very similar to each other. The bighead and silver carp, you probably will, like if you see one in real life, you're not gonna think it's any other fish because they've just got a really weird face with this like low hanging eye. Very distinctive and not like any of our native species. And so why are we so concerned about these guys? You've probably, seen news stories or heard about them. And we're actually concerned about them in different ways because they are different species. Overall, all of them have the ability to basically add extra stress to an already stressed Great Lakes food web or river food webs that we've seen like in the Illinois River. But they have different, like they're going to cause different pain points essentially in that food web. And that's because they all consume different organisms. The silver and bighead carp, which is on the left-hand side of your screen, are both filter feeders. So similar to our zebra and quagga mussels, these guys eat plankton out of the water column. Not great, especially in Lake Michigan, where we're already having issues with really low plankton numbers because of the zebra and quagga mussels. But again, plankton is kind of that base, base of the food web that a lot of species, especially juvenile fish, rely on. The black carp actually is a shellfish lover. It is specifically like it actually has these crushing teeth in its throat that is specialized for crushing the shells of clams, snails, mussels. And the challenge or the concern here is that we already have a lot of our freshwater native mussel species threatened or endangered in the Midwest. And the addition of these guys who are really great at eating freshwater mussels would add an additional layer of stress to that already imperiled group of organisms. And then finally, the grass carp, perhaps not surprisingly, given its name, is a vegetarian and it eats aquatic plants, which in some cases is good. It actually, one of the reasons it was brought over from Asia to North America was because it could help control weeds in ponds or lakes. But the problem is they are really good at eating plants, and so they can outcompete native herbivores, fish species, and by destroying existing vegetation, they can destroy habitat that's needed by native species. They also, because they're not exactly the cleanest, like they're very messy eaters. When they're foraging amongst the aquatic plants, they tend to stir up the sediment a lot, which causes a lot of turbidity and just general kind of muddiness. Not great. And so I kind of spoiled it a little bit with the grass carp, but how did this group of four species get to North America? So actually, they were brought over in the 1970s and 1980s for use as biocontrol in fish ponds in the southeastern US. All of them are really good at controlling whether it's nuisance weeds. There's certain species of snails that are nuisances in like aquaculture and can cause disease. So the black carp was really good at controlling those snails. Um, and then the silver and bighead carp did a really good job of preventing any like big algae blooms that would come, as a result of growing fish in a pond. However, these fish ponds were generally, isolated, not part of any particular, larger lake or connected to a river. But as everyone here probably knows, water moves where it wants to move. And especially since a lot of these farms were located in the Mississippi River Basin. See if, yep, my GIF will work. What happens is the Mississippi River, as we all probably know, tends to flood a lot, has a pretty extensive floodplain. And so sometimes these fish ponds would be connected to the Mississippi River or its tributaries during times of flooding or high water. And with access to that major artery, the bighead, silver, black, and grass carp have been able to kind of make their way upstream. And it's estimated now that just in the Illinois River, as one example, invasive carp make up something like 70% of the overall biomass of just everything in the river, kind of just crazy numbers. But I want to take a second just to highlight one species because this is the one that gets people's attention, and that is the silver carp. Oh, the silver carp. These are the jumping carp you've probably seen. Not all of the invasive carp species jump. This actually just these guys. They followed a similar path, kind of, from the southeastern US up and throughout the Mississippi River and the basin and its tributaries. They're the ones we're kind of concerned about, you'll see, oh, there was a sighting of a silver carp, close to Lake Michigan. And beyond their ability to mess up the food web of Lake Michigan, there's actually a human health concern or human well-being concern. And as funny as this GIF is, and you may have seen it on the internet, this poor man being hit in the face with a fish, it actually can cause human injuries. The silver carp jump out of the water when disturbed. However, they get disturbed at very minor things such as boat motors, you know, loud noises. And that is a challenge if you have a river or, other water body where you have people who are recreating. No one wants to go out and get hit in the face with a 40-pound fish. And just another one because I'm a glutton for punishment and like showing, this is US Fish and Wildlife Service out with electrofishing. And I guess shock pun intended, but electrofishing is another disturbance that obviously causes them to jump out of the water. And you can see just kind of the numbers of carp in this image. And so floods were the primary way that these invasive carp were able to get access to the Mississippi River Basin and throughout the kind of the central part of the country. But what we're actually seeing now too is that another pathway is potentially spreading invasive carp to new places, and that is through bait release. So minor, I wanted to take a second, these all look very similar. If you take a good look, you may notice some differences. But essentially, we're seeing sometimes that invasive carp, so these on the left-hand side are some native shad species, and the right are some invasive silver carp. And yes, if you take a good look, you may be like, okay, the eyes are slightly different. But if you've got a big bucket of bait, something gets mixed in there that you're not expecting, it can potentially introduce juvenile carp to new places, which then of course grow into adult carp. So another pathway that we need to be aware of, and as I'll talk about kind of here in a second, need to talk to people about so that they're aware that this is, a potential way that carp can be spreading. But first, what can we do about carp? So I apologize, it's kind of small on your screen, but on the left-hand side here is a picture of the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, which is a series of man-made waterways that link essentially Lake Michigan to the Illinois River. And this is sort of Grand Central Station right now for trying to prevent invasive carp from accessing Lake Michigan from the river. There's currently, I like to describe it as an electric fence for fish within in one of the canals that is essentially working like an electric fence for your pet. It shocks the fish, which deters them from continuing to move upstream. So far, it's been relatively successful, but research has shown that smaller fish aren't as affected by the electricity as larger fish. So it's not a perfect solution by any measure, which is why you've probably heard over the years, there's been a lot of back and forth about building new barriers at Brandon Lock and Dam. And this would actually be a layered approach where it wouldn't just be one thing like electricity. It'd be like electricity, then a carbon dioxide bubble net, then maybe acoustics, like using sound to deter. So it would be different stages. I believe construction is supposed to begin in the next year or so after some funding back and forth. But really the goal there is to just provide that extra layer because we know that electricity, while it's been effective, is not probably 100%. And then I have to bring this up just because it is something that people are talking about and proposing. The thought of, can we eat the invasive carp? And carp has a general bad rap when it comes to consumers. As Americans, we don't typically eat carp. We think of it as like the common carp, which is a bottom feeder, so not super appetizing. But the silver and big head carp are actually, again, because they're filter feeders, they're eating plankton, they're eating high up on the water column. So they generally have less contaminants. They've got kind of a white flaky fish or white flaky flesh. And so about 2 years ago, the Illinois DNR started a I don't know, rehab campaign for the invasive carp reputation and renamed it COPI, short for copious. Think back to those images of carp jumping out of the water, to try and entice consumers to try invasive carp, and maybe build up some interest to build a market for the species. Having eaten invasive carp, it's not bad. I mean, it kind of To me, it was like a tilapia, so kind of goes with whatever you cook it in, but not bad. So at this point, you're probably like, okay, great. I came out to this talk on a Thursday night, and now I'm feeling depressed because we've got, all these invasive species and these challenges. But it's actually, it's not all doom and gloom. There are things that we can do and that we are doing, and why it's really important to get, lots of people involved. So at the core, there's the research needs that we have. But it's not just biology that needs to be involved. As we've talked about, tonight, there's a lot of different aspects. So there's the need to study the physical environment, like hydrology. There's the need for engineering. There's especially a need for social science in terms of understanding the impacts to humans, the economics of different management decisions, um, even trying to understand human behavior about, what influences someone to clean their boat after they've been out, boating for a day. So definitely requires a lot of different disciplines to understand both the pathways, how things are introduced, as well as their potential impacts and actual impacts. But I would say even more so, hand in hand with that research is the need to talk about invasive species with people and give them the tools and resources that they need to, not only be aware of what's out there, but know like what are the potential impacts, what kinds of steps they can take. Um, and, just I think it's sometimes more challenging with aquatic invasive species than terrestrial species because you unless you're, out fishing all the time or you're out on your boat, you're not always seeing what's in the water. It's for some people, it's more out of sight, out of mind. And so needing to get the word out about what's out there and what challenges our waterways are facing is really important. And so my team at Sea Grant, that's pretty much what we do. We do a mix of research, especially thinking about, how do people communicate about invasive species, what drives their decision making about invasive species, as well as doing outreach and education. Just a couple of highlights of things that we've been doing, but by no means like, there's so many organizations in our state that are doing things too. But earlier this year, we hosted a training for the Illinois conservation police officers to help them uh, both understand the importance of enforcing regulations about invasive species, as well as we gave them some identifying. It was actually really fun. We taught these conservation police officers how to identify crayfish and fish to give them more confidence, if they do come across some potential invasive species, as well as we connected them with experts, and is a really good time for everybody. I loved seeing a bunch of uh, conservation police officers geek out over science. We've also taken some steps in translating a lot of our outreach materials because we know that we're serving, a bunch of diverse communities, and just having things in English isn't it means we're missing out on a lot of different groups. And then we've also been working with outdoor youth programs, so things like summer camps, museums, to really help create tools specifically for them, when students and kids are able to be out in nature, to really get a good sense of um, what invasive species are and what steps they can take to help prevent them. And so I did say I'd end with a little bit of, hope about what you can do as an individual and organizations to help. And so really some of the key steps are anytime you're going out on the water, the importance of cleaning, draining, and drying any of your equipment. Because as we mentioned, things like zebra mussel and quagga mussel larvae can stick to boats and fishing gear. Things like aquatic plants will often be, like on a prop of your boat. So just, it is an extra step, but it can make a lot of difference. if you like to garden or you like, landscaping, choosing native species as opposed to non-native species is a great step. If you have a pet or if you use live bait when fishing, just making sure not to release any of those. Especially for pets, it can feel like the humane thing to do to let your goldfish out in a pond, but it's both harmful because that's not it's not likely your goldfish is going to survive, but if it does, it's going to cause some major issues to that native ecosystem. Similarly with bait, it's kind of easy at the end of the day to just toss what you got, which again, you may think you have a bucket of native fish species, but it's always possible because some of those shiny little fish look very similar. You could have something that's potentially not supposed to be there. And then, especially if you're someone who likes being out in nature a lot, if you see something that's weird, taking steps to report it. And I know this one can feel a little tough because you're like, how do I know if something's weird? Who do I tell? So I have a couple slides just to hopefully give you a little bit more confidence about that. So the first thing about, is something unusual is trying to figure out what the heck is this? So I don't know how many of you are familiar, but there's a website, an app called iNaturalist, which allows you to submit photos that actually can get, identifications from scientists and other experts. So that's a really good place you could snap a pic and upload it there. The makers of iNaturalist also have an app called Seek, which you can download and actually point your phone at. I've noticed it's really good for plants. You can like point it at a plant and it will identify oftentimes really closely to being accurate, like what species that is. I haven't seen it used as much for fish because again, I think there's that terrestrial bias, but it's still a really cool thing to check out. But if you are interested in fish, Wisconsin Sea Grant has a really cool website and app that's just Fish ID, and it's, I would say, pretty user friendly. You can search by either a name or by appearance, and it allows you to choose like, oh, the tail looks kind of like this, or it's got this kind of coloration. So that can help you narrow it down. And then if you do want to report something, in Illinois, you generally will reach out to the DNR, and the things that they'll probably, ask you for or want to have are the location. So if you can have GPS coordinates, that's awesome. If not, if you could provide an address or general position relative to some kind of landmark. If you know the name of the invasive species, that can be really helpful. Both the common and the scientific name, again, if you know it. Whatever date you observe the species, your name and contact info, just so they could, ask any questions if they have it. And then especially, if you can get photos, that's usually their first go-to. Like they'll reach out to researchers at University of Illinois, other universities in the state who can help them make a positive identification. So the clearer and, more angles you can get of a potential invasive, the easier you will make that expert's life. I will throw in a plug too, if you're thinking about other ways of getting involved. Illinois Indiana Sea Grant helps administer the Master Watershed Steward program for Illinois and Indiana. I know they're going to be offering some training classes for like trainers in this program. I put the website on the slide and I can make it available afterwards too, but the Master Watershed Stewards get really involved in like river cleanups and helping essentially be eyes on the ground too. And that's obviously a good way that you can get involved, not just for aquatic invasive species, but helping to identify and help, take care of our local waterways. So with that, I know I'm wrapping up here, so I want to just give you a couple final thoughts to take home. Um, I hope throughout my talk I've convinced you that invasive species can cause some pretty extensive environmental and economic harm. While there are sometimes treatment options, oftentimes eradication is not very feasible. And if we want to manage a species over time, it generally takes continued management, which can definitely be costly. And it's really important, in general, just to be vigilant about preventing the introduction and spread of new species. That old saying that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure definitely rings true when it comes to invasive species. So with that, I will just leave you with some additional resources if you want to learn more. I've also got my email at the bottom of the slide. If you have any questions or would like to, you know, talk about anything more specific to a water body that you care about, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you all for your attention.
All right, thank you, Katie. That was a really great presentation. If anybody does have any questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat and I can read them aloud, or if anybody wants to unmute. I can start off with a question. Let me move my cat. Um, you had that graph at the beginning of like that curve
Oh
and
yeah.
talking about like early detection, and you mentioned like the iNaturalist or submitting um that slide that you just passed there. Is there anything else being done either in by individuals or by organizations to be able to do more early detection?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Hannah. I would say one tool that I know both like academics and I think some community organizations are getting involved with is the use of what's called environmental DNA to help with early detection. And so essentially what that technique is organisms like tend to shed little pieces of DNA, just like whether it's through scales, sloughing off, um, general aura of species in the water. And scientists can take samples from the water and actually look at the different types of DNA that are in it. Instead of trying to like, go out and catch a needle in a haystack, essentially, they can just take water samples and you can take lots of them. And that's one way that we've been trying to increase the early detection capabilities just because it's more cost effective and less, in some cases, less time intensive.
Okay, yeah, that's cool. So that's more like a high level.
That's more at a high level.
Mhm.
I think it's tough. I mean, there are groups doing monitoring of like certain locations over time, and I think that's still really valuable because it, oftentimes with invasive species, it's not a problem until it is, essentially,
Mhm.
which similar to this figure, it's like, okay, it's small, people aren't noticing it, and then all of a sudden, oh no, it's a problem. So if we can have more people early on being like, hey, this was weird,
Mhm.
before we get to that, oh no, it's a problem stage.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, and then there's a question in the chat. It says, have any of these invasive species brought diseases in that has spread to native species?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I don't know if, and I apologize for not knowing exactly. There is a disease that has been brought in. I don't know by what particular species, but it's called VHS, which is viral hemorrhagic septicemia. We always just call it VHS, but it's
Mhm.
a disease in fish that it causes fish die-offs. Typically they kind of like have bloody spots on their body. It's not a super pretty pretty disease, but it's something that especially has been pretty devastating in like the bait fishing uh, business when you raise bait fish because it can get into stock and cause these mass die-offs.
Mhm.
That's one species or one pathogen that's been brought over. I don't know of many others in the Great Lakes, but in kind of a turnaround, species of crayfish that are native to North America have become invasive in Europe, and
Mhm.
they've brought with them this crayfish plague, which has had really devastating effects on native crayfish species in Europe. So its pathogens are definitely a concern of ours. I think we've been relatively lucky in our region that we haven't seen a ton yet from the aquatics, at least.
Mhm. Okay, and then I'm just gonna keep asking questions unless somebody else stops me. But you're talking about that electric fence type thing
Yeah.
that's in the canal. Does that have any negative effects for native species?
That's actually a great question. So there is a research group out of Loyola University at Chicago that's been looking at the effects of the the electricity on native species. I want to say they found some effects. They haven't been
Mhm.
major, but it's one of those things like, is it another stressor on species that are already in a pretty stressful environment, these urban waterways? So not like lethal effects,
Mhm.
but sort of this another just another straw on the camel's back?
Mhm. Does it also prevent them from moving through that area though? Does that cause any issues?
You know, that's a good question. I don't know if anyone's looked at like that flow of genetics, like if it's preventing species from mixing
Mhm.
essentially. Um, I don't know if there's been a lot of work in that area yet. I mean, it's very possible. Again, it may be less of an effect if smaller fish are able to get through every now and then, like there's still
Yeah.
an exchange. But I think that is something interesting that I'm not sure of that there's any work out there yet.
Okay. Um, I have one more. Oh, sorry, there's another comment in the
Yeah.
chat. Um, it says, okay, I don't know what the one of these words is, which is what's throwing me off.
Oh,
Uh,
rotenone. Okay.
retinone. Yeah, okay. So they didn't use retinone in the Chicago Sanitary Canal some years ago, I think because they detected invasive carp in that body of water.
Yeah, so rotenone is essentially it's somewhat of a nuclear option when you're dealing with invasive fish. It's a chemical that you can put into a water body, but it's non-selective, meaning it will just kill off all of the fish.
Hmm.
I I can't recall exactly when it was. I believe there was a treatment of it. The one challenge too is because when you're dealing with like these flowing water ecosystems, timing it right so that you are, you know, treating a section of the river without, allowing for upstream and downstream
Hmm.
migrants to come in. Um, it is, again, it's another tool in the toolbox, and in some cases it is appropriate. It's just it is sort of a nuclear option when you need to start fresh.
Okay. And then one of our avid fishermen has a question of how can you tell if the bait at the tackle store is native or invasive, and do the shop owners usually know?
Yeah, so I would say generally the shop owners are doing a really good job of keeping track of their shipments. The problem is sometimes, like I mentioned, there's it when they're so tiny, it can be really tough to ID even for like really seasoned anglers. So there are some programs, I don't know if they've done much in Illinois yet, where different like scientists are going around and taking water samples from bait shops to say like, oh, well, what species, like do the species you were told you got or told you raised,
Mhm.
actually the species you have in your tanks. I would say, no matter no matter if you think you've got like, invasive or native bait, it's always good to err on the side of caution and just, if you've got some live bait at the end of the day when you're fishing, not dumping it into the water. Maybe putting it into the trash, or if you need a humane way of disposing it, maybe taking it back to a bait shop. We've been trying to do some outreach with bait shops just to make them aware so that they know it's a potential thing. But I mean, it's definitely something to be on the lookout for, but I will say it can be very tough because those tiny fish are so tough to ID
Mhm.
sometimes.
Yeah. Okay. And then my other question was, oh, are there any um non-native species that aren't maybe not classified as invasive yet, but are kind of like we're looking out for them in the area?
Yeah, that's a good question. We do actually have some like watch list species, which are species like you mentioned that aren't in our area necessarily yet, but we know that maybe they're in states nearby or they're popular in the pet trade. One that I would say we're really on the lookout for is called the marbled crayfish. It's a species of crayfish that is popular in the pet trade.
Mhm.
Um, there's been a couple sightings around the Great Lakes, like in Ontario and Minnesota. So far, nothing in Illinois yet. Knock on wood. But the one challenge with the marbled crayfish is they actually can reproduce asexually, so they don't need, um, necessarily to have a male and a female in a like when introduced into a new population. And so that's concerning, if you just have like one individual who can reproduce, that makes it a lot easier to get a population started.
Mhm.
So that the marbled crayfish is one we're definitely on the lookout for, but not here yet.
Mhm. Okay, does anybody else have any other questions for Katie?
Yeah, and as I said, I'm happy if you think of something later on, want to shoot me an email, always happy to chat.
Okay, if there's no other questions, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. Thank you again, Katie, for
Yeah, of
presenting.
course.
Great. Um, we have one more fall speaker, which will be on November 19th, which I believe is next Tuesday. And that will be Brian Siccardi from University of Illinois, and he'll be talking about the carbon cycle in agricultural and prairie soils of the Midwest. And I have been told that he does really good presentations. So thanks everybody for coming out tonight. Hope to see you guys in future events. All right, and thanks again, Katie.
Yeah, thanks everyone.